opening session of this year's Debating Development series. This year is the 17th edition already, and for the very first time we are organizing the debates online for obvious reasons. So let's see how that works out. And I'm really glad to see so many people have shown interest in this event. We have received way over 500 registrations, but we are forced to limit the audience to about 500. But we can never be sure, of course, how many people eventually show up, but some people may still pop in, as we also have a long waiting list. But of course, we are very happy to see that there's a huge interest in this event. So a warm welcome to all of you. I'm Geert van Hekke. I'm a lecturer at the Institute of Development Policy, the IOB, here at the University of Antwerp. I'm the academic coordinator of this Debating Development series, and I will also be the host or moderator for tonight's exciting event. But before I present both speakers to you, I'd like to take about 5 to max 10 minutes of your time and give you some more context about this series and about the overarching topic that we have chosen for this year's event, and then also very briefly discuss some practicalities to guide you through the rest of this event. So Debating Development is a yearly event or series of events organized at our university as a partnership between the Institute of Development Policy, IOB, and the University Foundation for Development Cooperation, USOS, and with generous financial support also from the VLIR UOS Global Minds program. We have a fantastic team of people who have helped organizing these debates throughout the past 6 months or more even. So already a very big thanks to all of them. The series is both a what we call basket course or interfaculty-wide course for students at our university. This year we have about 100 enrolled students. And at the same time, it's also a public event that is open to a broader audience. Our main objective is to provide a public platform for reflection on topics related to so-called international development. And so each year we identify and focus on one overarching relevant theme, and then kind of provide different perspectives by inviting speakers from international institutes, civil society organizations, and from academia to have a conversation or a debate, a constructive debate about particular topics within the selected theme. This year, our debates focus on decolonial perspectives and what this actually means and entails both in theory and in practice. More particularly, we have tried to seek out the most contentious issues in the relationship between so-called development and decolonization. And our intention is not to pinpoint a universal understanding of what decolonization is, but rather to put ideas of decolonization into conversation with the multiple meanings these ideas may imply within specific contexts. Broadly speaking, decolonization reflects grounded struggles that recognize and mobilize against Eurocentric domination that has historically and continues to systematically oppress and homogenize other ways of being. And while calls for decolonization are nothing new, it has recently received quite some attention. For example, through the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, its resonance around the world. Also the dismantling of public statues of glorified colonial oppressors, mobilizations of indigenous land defenders, increasing worldwide civil unrest against global inequality and the consequences of neoliberal economic policies. All of these events, processes, or movements in fact highlight the importance of different interpretations of what decolonization means in different social and historical contexts. In this sense, the debate on decolonization has enormous social, economic, political, ecological, and cultural implications because it forces us to profoundly rethink relationships that dismantle or question racial, gender, and class binaries that have been historically imposed and reinforced within so-called Western-style development. And so in this series, we want to unpack, together with our speakers and with all of you, some of the main insights on decolonization that social movements and academics from different parts of the world have constructed, and to seek out together how these discussions and some of the demands are relevant to contemporary debates. And this brings me to tonight's conversation, which will kind of set the scene for all other debates that we have planned over the course of the next 2 months, that you can check on our website and on the slide that is shown here on the screen. So for this opening debate, we have invited Professor Achille Mbembe and Ms. Els Hertogen to reflect on decolonial and non-Western perspectives such as post-development or alternatives to development as a critique to the rising neoliberal development models in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and to put this in conversation with what these concepts mean for global engagement, and more particularly, what kind of implications they have in terms of profoundly challenging or rethinking the role of development aid and development cooperation in advocating for systemic change. So something more on our invited speakers. Our keynote speaker is Professor Achille Mbembe. Professor Mbembe is a historian and political scientist and very influential voice in debates on post-colonial theories. He's currently a member of the staff at the WITS Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, and also has an annual visiting appointment at the Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke University. His research interests lie in the social sciences, African history, and politics. More precisely, Professor Mbembe investigates the post-colony that comes after decolonization. He has written extensively on contemporary theory, including works such as On the Post-Colony, published in 2001, Critique of Black Reason, published in 2016, Brutalism, which is a critique of technology in a planetary age, that was published earlier this year, and Out of the Dark Night, Essays on Decolonization, to be published by the end of this year. After Professor Mbembe's keynote, we invite Ms. Els Hertogen as a discussant to provide a brief reflection on some of the points raised during the keynote speech. Ms. Els Hertogen is head of the NGO 11-11-11 or 11-11, the umbrella of the Flemish North-South movement. She studied political and social sciences at the University of Leuven, where she also specialized in international relations. Before she became head of 11-11 in 2019, she already had over 10 years of experience in the organization. She also has a background as a researcher on topics covering development cooperation and the role of civil society actors. And Els Hertogen has also been an activist since childhood, fighting against injustice and inequality. And still today, she's actively involved in volunteering work and international solidarity in her hometown of Hasselt. So how will this work? First, I will give the floor to Professor Mbembe, who will give a keynote of about 30 to 40 minutes. When there's 5 minutes left, I will give a sign. After that, we immediately invite Ms. Hertogen, who will have about 20 minutes to provide some reflections on the keynote speech. And then we'll have time for some questions by the audience. But more particularly, we start with questions from our students who have been asked to read some of the texts that were suggested by both speakers. And on the basis of those texts, they have submitted some questions that I will build upon together with some additional questions or ideas just to get the conversation started. And then also later on, the broader audience, so all of you, also have the chance to ask some questions at the end, and we will later show you where you can submit those questions. So in the meantime, we ask you to write down your questions, and then later on you'll be able to submit them through an online system in which people also will get the chance to vote for the most relevant questions at the same time. We know it's not ideal, but in these circumstances, we think this is the best or the most democratic way to deal with questions. So without further ado, I now give the floor to our keynote speaker, Professor Achille Mbembe.
Thank you very much, Gert. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to listening to Els and the contribution she has to make to tonight's debate. Let me start with a few words on our present. Obviously, these are not normal times, as you intimated. These are extraordinary times. They are fraught with urgency and uncertainty. Yet, these are also times that point to numerous possibilities. And it is this space between uncertainty and possibility that I think contemporary critical thought should inhabit, whether it is grappling with questions of development, quote unquote, questions of decoloniality, or for that matter, questions of planetarity, since after all, this is, it seems to me, truly what is at stake. And because of the combination of urgency, uncertainty, and possibility, more than ever before, we no longer have the luxury of thinking as usual, nor can we keep relying on old certainties. So for these reasons, I thought I should organize my thoughts around one overarching question. This overarching question can be formulated as follows. Is there a pathway for Africa's rise out of poverty in the 21st century? More precisely, is it possible to imagine a different kind of growth and a different pathway to a different kind of growth? In my mind, the two terms, a different kind of growth and a different pathway to a different kind of growth, in my mind, these two terms mean the same thing. When I invoke growth, what I mean is a kind of growth whose means and ultimate goal is the maintenance of life in Africa and on Earth. What I mean is a kind of growth which prioritizes the conservation of the living world over private property. A kind of growth which protects humans, but which also helps renegotiate an entirely new set of relations between humans and entities that are alive but not human. In other words, it is a kind of growth that deliberately decolonizes or inverts the current hierarchy of norms. The ultimate goal of this inversion is to protect not what for a very long time we have been calling nature, not even what we have been calling the environment, but what we should call the living, le vivant in French. Why? Well, because life in general, our biosphere, the Earth, and in fact, the total ensemble of living beings and organisms This is what is actually threatened by the system of private property rights, on which I would argue our entire modern civilization is founded. So as you can see, the question of what we call development, that is, for me, of a different kind of growth and different form of relation with the earth, this question is not an exclusively African question. It is not peculiar to the global south. It is universal in the sense that we share it with other parts of the world, a world which is now facing changes of a planetary nature. I want to insist on this planetary dimension of our global predicament, partly because the changes we are witnessing affect human and non-human existence at large. They put into question the concept of habitability, that is, the conditions necessary for life to persist in the long run. They force us to think differently about the world we live in and our place in it, a place which only makes sense in relation to the place of others. Yet, as we know, the overwhelming fact is that the chemical, atmospheric, and material interactions and connections between the total ensemble of living beings and what is outside their membranes, these interactions have been deeply altered. Under these circumstances, to undertake, as I am calling for, to undertake a broad critical rethinking of Africa's development model, to do that is by definition to reflect anew about the puzzle of Earth's long-term stability and sustainability. I'm saying all of this in a very peculiar context, which itself, I would argue, is characterized by a number of things. The first is the redrawing of the global map of development. This redrawing is fueled by a weaker and weaker commitment to multilateralism, or even a retreat from multilateralism. Growing calls for protectionism and economic nationalism, including concern for industrial sovereignty, all point, it seems to me, to increasing divergence and polarization. And this process might further increase inequalities between countries and entire regions. That's the first element of the context. The second is the accelerating processes of digitalization in all sectors. In the African continent, as well as in other parts of the global south, our economies are still based, as you know, on the extraction and export of raw materials. Yet worldwide, data and speed are turning to be increasingly significant economic assets, which means that being on the right side of the global digital divide is becoming pivotal to socio-economic fortunes. Online working, digitally organized logistics, all of this is gaining further relevance and centrality as the platform economy and associated firms continue to grow in importance. The third element of this new context is the renewed entanglement of both climate change and what is now known as interspecies health. arguably, these are two of the most acute global development challenges of our time. And it is pretty clear that both will heighten already growing concerns with insulation from risks and dangers of all kinds, while encouraging the emergence of new forms of remote management, if these two challenges are not, let's say, dealt with in an appropriate manner. Now, that's the first set of comments I wanted to share. Now moving to the second set of remarks and observations. And these have to do with the two key concepts that have been put forward by the organizers of this debate, the concept of post-development and that of decoloniality. I would like to address them indirectly. The argument I want to put forward is that Earth's long-term stability, or if you want, the persistence of life on Earth, all of this is threatened by a new variety of colonialism I call techno-molecular colonialism. Let me go back to historical facts briefly. This will help us to understand what it is that I mean by techno-molecular colonialism. Historically, as many of you know, the expansion of European colonialism had to do with one broad question. We tend to forget it. The question of who is it that the earth belongs to? This is the question which propelled colonialism, in particular European colonialism. This was the key dynamic underlying colonial conquest and imperial expansion, at least since the 15th century. With the partition of Africa in the 19th century, European powers had decided that the earth in its entirety belonged to them. They convinced themselves that they were its true owners and they could occupy lands that were populated by foreign people. They could extract the wealth of these lands. They could exploit the people who had always inhabited them, thereby carving out spheres of influence each of them had control over. So to a large extent, colonial expansion was a project of planetary occupation. Although driven in large part by national states and national business companies, it mostly had to do with the reallocation of the Earth's resources and their privatization by those who had the greatest military might and the largest technological advantage. So for anyone who is interested in the genealogy or in the foundations of the current world order, there is a kinship, a deep kinship between, for instance, plantation slavery, colonial predation, and contemporary forms of resource extraction and appropriation. To be sure, these historical formations, plantation slavery, colonial systems, and contemporary forms of resource extraction, these historical formations have one thing in common, in spite, of course, of their many differences. They have one thing in common. At their core is a constitutive denial of the fact that we, the humans, co-evolve with the biosphere, depend on it, are defined with and through it, and owe each other, we and the biosphere, a debt of responsibility and care. They all deny that, and that is what makes them, let's say, parents, or if you want, that's what is common to them. An important difference, though, between colonial times and our present is the technological escalation that has led to the emergence of computational capitalism in our times. To put it simply, to the era of the machine has succeeded the age of algorithms. Even more seriously, we are witnessing a shifting distribution of powers between the human and the technological, in the sense that technologies are moving towards general intelligence and self-replication. A clear example in this regard is the emergence of, I would say, the last decades of new algorithmic forms of intelligence, many of whom have been growing in parallel with genetic research and often in alliance with it. The integration of algorithms and big data analysis in the biological sphere has not only brought with it a greater belief in techno-positivism and modes of course, statistical thought, it has also, I would argue, paved the way for regimes of assessment of the natural world. It has paved the way for modes of prediction and analysis that treat life itself as a computable object. Concomitantly, algorithms inspired by the natural world and ideas of natural selection and evolution are on the rise. Such is the case of genetic algorithms. Very interesting thinkers such as Margarida Des has shown, for instance, that today everything is potentially computable. Life itself is increasingly construed via statistics, via metadata, via modeling, via mathematics, and we are increasingly surrounded by multiple and expanding wave fronts of calculation. In the process, what is denied is the fact that life itself is an open system, a non-linear system. It is exponentially chaotic, if you want. And it is partly what I call techno-molecular colonialism. Now, technological escalation, in turn, is threatening to turn us all into artifacts and to make redundant a huge chunk of the muscular power capitalism relied upon for a long time. It follows that today, although its main target remains the human body and earthly matter, domination and exploitation are becoming increasingly abstract and reticular. As a repository of our desires and emotions, our dreams, our fears, our fantasies, our mind and our psychic life have become the main raw material which digital capitalism aims at capturing and commodifying. But just as old forms of colonialism, techno-molecular colonialism also relies on racial subsidies. Racism itself, and anti-black racism in particular, is becoming ever more insidious, ever more viral, ever more encompassing, ever more primal, and ever more brutal, as we all know and as we have seen recently. But as the world becomes a huge data emporium, future forms of racism will be more and more generated by and instituted through data, through calculation, and through computation. In short, racism is relocating both underneath and at the surface of the skin. It does no longer exclusively reproduce itself via police brutality and mass incarceration, although these are still key features of contemporary forms of captivity. It increasingly reproduces itself via screens, via mirrors of various kinds. It is becoming both corporeal, spectral, and fractal. Now, blacks, of course, are still some of its privileged targets, but blackness itself is morphing into multiple other figurations, perhaps more than at any other moment in our recent past. We are increasingly faced with the question of what to do with those whose very existence does not seem to be necessary for our reproduction, those whose mere existence or even proximity is deemed to represent a physical or biological threat to our own life, those human bodies deemed either in excess, unwanted, illegal, dispensable, or superfluous. Now, people deemed surplus, unwanted, or illegal are more and more governed in the same way Western slave, post-slave societies have always governed blacks. That is, through brutality, indifference, neglect, abandonment, and the abdication of any responsibility for their lives and their welfare. This is what I have called in an earlier book the becoming black of the world. At the beginning of the 21st century, all those who are governed like blacks, that is, like discounted people, are also subjected to new forms of wars, which can be called wars on speed or wars on mobility. These are wars whose aim is to turn discounted bodies into borders. And such wars generally begin by turning into dust and piles of ruins the milieus, as well as means of existence and survival of vulnerable people, thus forced to flee in search of refuge. And such milieus, ecosystems, and habitats are rendered, if you want, toxic and uninhabitable. These kinds of wars against milieus and ecosystems rendered toxic and uninhabitable, these kinds of wars are not at all accidental. In fact, they are methodically programmed, methodically conducted, and such milieus and ecosystems are sites of experimentation of new weapons. The targets of this kind of warfare are not by any means singular bodies, but rather great swaths of humanity judged worthless, in excess, and superfluous. So, late forms of molecular colonialism are, as you can see, anyway, as I have tried to argue, responsible for the production at a massive scale of discounted bodies, residual humanity that is akin to waste. And with our entry into a new climatic regime, this process will only intensify. As the global conditions for the production of life, the reproduction of life on Earth, as these conditions keep changing, population politics at a planetary level will increasingly become synonymous with waste management. So that's the second set of remarks I wanted to put on the table. Let me now move on with the third set of remarks, which will lead me to some kind of conclusion. The third set of remarks are related to what for me is the ongoing redrawing of the global development map. I'm not talking here about post-development, I'm talking about the ongoing redrawing of the global development map, development in the sense I try to define it as a way of living with the earth in an age of techno-molecular colonialism. What kind of growth path, what kind of path to growth, at least in Africa, can we carve out in this age of techno-molecular colonialism, in context in which we have somewhat lost our ability to live with the earth? That is the set of remarks I want to develop now. The redrawing of the global development map, I think, is fast leading to a widening divergence between three competing concepts of development. First of all, development as permanent emergency. Second, development as a techno-managerial project. And third, development as a new way of living with the earth. After a century of experimentation under colonialism and in its aftermath, there are a number of things we now know. We know, for instance, that development involves a two-way relation between global norms and local practice. We know that for global norms to be useful and to make a difference, they must be embedded in local histories and locally grown initiatives and programs. We also know that development, properly understood, does not start from needs and problems. It must build on local assets, local strengths, and local possibilities. So we must shift our focus of attention from needs to assets. Assets, of course, as we know, do not consist only in capital and investments. They include the physical, environmental, social, cultural attributes that can be reframed as inputs into local economic development. Now, where does Africa fit in all I've so far shared with you? As far as Africa is concerned, I believe that living with the earth should become the new name of development. Everything else, systems of governance, forms of regional integration, social contract, all of these should derive from this imperative. I think this is the only credible response we can oppose to what I have called techno-molecular colonialism. The only real strategic choice we have is to craft a model of growth in the 21st century that maximizes Africa's ability to safeguard its natural capital effectively. This, of course, must be coupled with effective and sustainable natural resource governance. The goal is not only to substantively reduce Africa's vulnerability to climate change. The care for sustainable ecosystems and natural environments must become the bedrock, in fact, of every sectoral policy. So it is the paradigm itself that must change. We have to go for a different kind of growth and design a different path to a different kind of growth, to a model that puts at its center sustainable ecosystems. Only such a model can support the kind of environmental and economic functions which are critical to the people of Africa. Of course, at least for me, such a strategic choice goes beyond a simple embrace of green growth or the promotion of innovations in finance and markets as a solution to the ecological crisis, or the rewriting of conservation practices and non-human worlds in terms of banking and financial categories. We have to rely on those resources or assets that constitute life support systems for human well-being in our continent, starting with our rich biodiversity and our natural capital. These should form the basis of a climate resilient path to Africa's growth. In the notes shared with Els, I go on then to list a number of key interventions, concrete set of policies which might help to, let's say, realize this kind of agenda. Such policies, I will just list them before I conclude, should necessarily include let's say, relying on our rich biodiversity, which includes land, which includes air, which includes wind, water, forests, marine resources, and so on. And of course, the most important resource in this regard is arable land, arguably the most prized asset for food production, for nutritional health, and economic development. Second, we must put our people to work. We must put them to work in the absence of a high productivity manufacturing sector. And to put them to work, a climate resilient path to growth is our best chance. It is our best chance to put the largest number of our people to work, a precondition for a full-scale eradication of poverty. A third area of intervention has to do with the management of Africa's deconfinement. This is what is called in policy parlance regional integration. But it's more than regional integration. We have to deconfine the continent. And in order to deconfine the continent, we have to manage methodically and deliberately the phasing out of colonial borders, internal borders inherited from colonialism. I have some other notes on the kinds of jobs reservoirs that are potentially available, which we haven't dealt with. I have other propositions or proposals on how we could invest in agriculture, in rural markets, and in small towns. Of course, all of this cannot happen without a new social contract. A new social contract which would push us beyond the reforms we recorded in the 90s, which rested upon getting the principle of getting the institutions right, which involved, for instance, the creation of regulatory agencies that were supposed to be above the pay of partisan politics, the removal of important state functions from the domain of electoral politics. The problem is that all of these reforms, the major aim was to create the conditions for the entry of the continent into the age of neoliberalism. We have to turn that upside down. There are a number of proposals too on re-territorializing the economy, on investing in inter-health species. I won't go into species health. Let me just conclude because my time is up in 4 minutes. Let me end by repurposing the debate around a set of statements or propositions. The first proposition is that we only have one world. Of course, we might dream about colonizing Mars or Venus or other unknown planets in the future, but for the time being, that is not part of our actuality. We only have one world, one solar system, and for this world to last as long as possible, and for this solar system to last as long as possible, this earth should be shared. It should be shared. It is a shared roof and our shared shelter. And sharing this roof and shelter is the precondition for the sustainability of life on Earth. That's the first proposition. We have to share it as equitably as possible, which is different from colonialism, whether colonialism of the old or what I have called techno-molecular colonialism. We have to share it as equitably as possible. And in any case, our lives here and elsewhere have become so entangled that trying to separate them will require a tremendous amount of violence. It will require a lot of violence to disentangle humanity from itself and from the rest of the living species. And therefore, especially in the face of the kinds of ecological challenges we face, it is absolutely important to reinvent forms of life in common that go beyond the requisites of the nation state, of ethnicity, of race, religion, and so on. Second consideration, for a long time, we have been concerned with how life emerges and the conditions of its evolution. The key question today is how it can be repaired, how it can be reproduced, sustained, and cared for, how it can be made durable, preserved, and once again universally shared, and under what conditions it ends. Overall, these debates about how life on Earth can be reproduced and sustained and under what conditions it ends are forced upon us by the epoch itself, characterized as it is by the impending ecological catastrophe and by technological escalation. I'm not sure that these questions can be properly answered from a purely market logic perspective that addresses life as commodity to be manipulated and replicated under conditions of volatility. But I know for sure that by setting the boundary that distinguishes between the calculable and the incalculable, by inventing different modes of measuring what counts and why, by turning new instruments of calculation into powerful instruments of liberation, we will be able to open up the possibility of a different aesthetics, a different politics of inhabiting the earth, repairing it, and of sharing the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Achille, for this very inspiring talk. As discussed or as said before, we now immediately give the floor to Els Hertogen, who is the discussant and who will reflect a bit on what you have just said and also draw some parallels or some lessons for the development sector, NGO sector in Belgium and more broadly. So the floor is yours, Els, and thanks again, Achille, for this talk.
Yes, okay. So, Gert, do you hear me? I just want to check.
Yes, yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Okay.
I will now mute myself.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Achille, for this very interesting start of the evening. I've been asked, as Gert said, to reflect upon the challenges posed by post-development paradigms, such as Achille just explained to you all, and the call for decolonization to civil society organizations working on international solidarity, often referred to as development NGOs. Before I start my presentation, I will briefly present myself so you know the perspective from which I will be speaking. I'm the director of Triple 11, which is the umbrella organization of the Flemish North-South movement. This is a name we probably must change, but I will come to this later on in my presentation. We unite 60 organizations, Flemish and Belgian, 20,000 volunteers and hundreds of citizens' initiatives on international solidarity. In 1966, we arose as a fundraising campaign to collect funds to tackle hunger in West Africa. And several organizations at that moment decided to work together and start a collective campaign. We started this as a classic fundraising campaign, but it was interesting that we gathered up with different committees. And throughout the years, we evolved to an organization uniting several Flemish organizations, investing in policy influencing by lobbying, mobilization, and communication, but also by building partnerships with organizations around the world. We as Triple 11 have partnerships, but our member organizations have also strongly embedded partnerships all around the world. Although we maintain a yearly fundraising campaign coming up in November, with the coming weeks, you will notice this in Flanders. Although we just maintained the fundraising campaign, we shifted towards an organization, a network focusing on political change by mobilizing and advocating for global justice. Besides my profession, I have been involved in the anti-racism movement in my teenager years and have been a volunteer for Triple 11 and other organizations. I studied political science at the Catholic University of Leuven, which means I've been raised and educated using the frames and development paradigms that were considered mainstream in this society. So I am very much aware that my insights, therefore, are narrowed down to those theoretical frameworks these experiences, and of course my own personal character and way of looking at society. I just actually know very little, but I'm willing to learn, to change my perspective, to evolve and continuously be curious. So I was very pleased to hear Mr. Mbembe's presentation. So I thank you for inviting me, and I will humbly shed my light on this presentation, but also will present to you some thoughts I have on the issue of decolonization. And hopefully I will give you some insight in the discussions we are having at this moment within 11, the network that we are on this topic. Hoping this will trigger your own vision on international solidarity and inviting you to ask questions afterwards and challenge my way or way of thinking and practicing, because we still have a lot to learn from each other. I will thus not reflect from the perspective of a scholar, well aware of all post-development paradigms and discussions. I am not aware of all those interesting academic discussions, nor do I have a broad experience in the global south, apart from some visits, but I will reflect on this as someone who knows the Flemish movement for international solidarity quite well and is eager to contribute to the necessary change I see. I would like to put forward 3 thoughts to explain to you which change I would like to see within the broader movement for international solidarity, starting within my own organization. Those thoughts are, firstly, yes, we need to change our perspective on development. Secondly, yes, we need to change our perspective on development cooperation. And thirdly, yes, we as CSOs need to further decolonize our organizations themselves. So firstly, yes, we need to change our perspective on development. As Achille Mbembe has put very well, we need to get rid of old certainties. Besides focusing on growth and measuring growth solely on the basis of domestic incomes, things that are calculable, we also have been talking about the balance between people, planet, profit, about sustainability for decades now. Nonetheless, during the past 50 years, we have seen climate change evolving in a rapid speed. Species have been vanishing at a horrific rate and inequality has been rising. Since COVID-19, extreme poverty and hunger are rising again, which means that the prediction of the end of history has been proven wrong. We have not achieved a global system which will gradually evolve towards a situation where all human beings are able to foresee in basic welfare and well-being. On the contrary, the trends that Achille Mbembe describes, such as climate change, digitalization, retreat from multilateralism, make it very clear we cannot hold on to our normal way of thinking about development. And I would like to add another trend, rising inequality. While we are all floating on the same sea, it's clear that some are soup yards, some are in super yachts, while others are clinging to drifting rubber boats. And when the storm hits, our situation is inherently unequal. According to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, inequality is an issue which defines our time and risks destroying the world's economies and societies. According to a recent report of the World Bank, the gap between rich and poor is only rising. In addition to this immediate impact of COVID on health outcomes and tragically on lives, it is also now clear that the coronavirus outbreak is likely to have long-lasting economic and social impacts of global proportions. I therefore totally agree with Achille that we need to put Earth, planet, nature first, but it should always be accompanied with policies also putting social well-being for everyone in the forefront, as Achille puts forward by addressing the change he would like to see regarding the labor market and also the importance to reinvent democracy. We also need to recognize that richer countries have different responsibilities in building back better, not in the least because of an historic aspect of equality, colonialism. The global north, especially Europe, imposed colonial rule on much of the global south for centuries, through violence and coercion. These unjust power relations still are present in our global system and international agreements. As consequences, it hinders progress instead of leading a way out of inequality. So what are the consequences for civil society organizations working on international solidarity? We need to change our narratives and be open to different paradigms. Our first challenge is to truly connect global movements to inspire each other, as Achille Mbembe inspired me this evening. For example, on the rights of nature, where in Latin America there is a strong movement on how to reconciliate, how to address polarization societies. As 1111, we also still have a long way to go, but our intention is to be open and to question our own paradigms. One example is that due to push from partner organizations with whom we work together in Latin America and Asia, the ecological perspective has become part of our vision and mission. We aim for realizing human rights for all within the boundaries of our planet. But we still have a very long way to go to open up to different paradigms, because this also means we need to change our terminology and choose to no longer speak of development, north-south, etc. Although good alternatives are not that easy to find, so all suggestions are welcomed. Secondly, it is up to civil society to support citizens and to reclaim civic space. In this way, we can shift power, so other voices are being heard and gain power. Worldwide, we see a trend of narrowing down civic space for critical voices. We must always speak out and support each other to keep on addressing injustice and to put forward other ways of looking at development. Thirdly, we need to see opportunities instead of only focusing on negative trends, such as also Achille has been doing this evening. Solidarity at local level is on the rise and should find interest at global level. Digitalization also creates the opportunity to break through power spaces, such as, for example, happened on Moria, the refugee camp in Greece. The videos that reached out civil society and citizens made it possible to start up a movement. And also climate change should force us to look for international solidarity and solutions. So as civil society, we must see where change is taking place locally, regionally, and strengthen these dynamics in order to show the world is possible, that another narrative, another way of looking at development is possible. That was my first thought. So my second thought, yes, we need to change our perspective on development cooperation. Charity is out, justice is in. Development assistance is out, cooperation is in. North-South is out, international solidarity is in. So how do we make this change? Firstly, by recognizing that development cooperation in general is rooted in imperialistic and paternalistic ideas. For example, the Belgian Ministry of Development Cooperation has been evolved out of the Ministry of Colonies, which does, however, not mean that there has not been an evolution and that all things are bad. Definitely not. But recognizing this historical perspective, however, means that we also need to recognize that existing inequalities are rooted in colonization. We therefore need to realize that development cooperation inherently is colonial, but this does not mean we need to end it right away. No, it obliges us all to truly look at the causes of lasting poverty, inequality, three levels: socioeconomic, ecological, but also democratic, and to tackle those root causes. Secondly, we have to realize that international solidarity is always political, in a sense that our aim should be to change the world, to become more equal, more just. It may not be mere a technical, neutral agenda where we try to manage aid transfers in the most cost-efficient way. Investing in social change means accepting risks, long-term trajectories, and unexpected outcomes. Thirdly, by trying to change policies in policy domains that are crucial to achieve a more just and equal system, such as fiscal policies, trade policies, climate change policies, migration policies. It is equally important to address policymakers on their ambition to tackle climate change, since the burdens are disproportionately distributed amongst populations around the world, as it is to challenge them to develop national and international fiscal policies that are aiming for transparency and just taxation. Fourthly, by continuing to plea for specific financial transfers that are aimed at removing barriers to accessing public services such as education, healthcare, or social protection, but also aimed at strengthening a strong civil society. 1111 has been doing this for decades now. We get criticized on our plea towards the Belgian government to spend 0.7% of its domestic income on these kind of financial transfers, officially still referred to as development assistance. This terminology must change, but it's still needed, this kind of financial transfer. Whether it should change to reparations, honestly, I do not know. At this moment, I do not have an opinion. I'm very interested in finding out what can be the win for populations worldwide, what to do with those contexts where there is no clear colonial link. For example, must Belgium withdraw from showing solidarity with people from Syria? So it's a very interesting discussion. And it's also very interesting to question how to tackle this question of reparations, but at the same time keep investing in strong change makers worldwide who genuinely make a difference in the global south, but also in Belgium and Europe. For example, so we do our fundraising campaign as 1111. Part of those finances go, for example, to Vluchtelingenwerk Vlaanderen. It's an organization that supports refugees in Flanders itself. Fifthly, what we have to do is we have to change from needs to assets, as Achille has said. One of those assets is the strength of social movements. And our cooperation must not merely focus on setting institutions right, but putting equivalent effort and resources in building grassroots political movements around substantive demands. Then you cooperate on a common agenda. I totally agree with Achille that we must reinvent democracy. Governance does not just mean providing social security against crisis and risks of all kinds, which is very important, but it also means ensuring interactions between all living beings and things in our environment in a harmonious way. Sixth, we may not call for an end of development assistance as a financial transfer, but we have to call for a totally different approach. We have to shift the power, we have to aim for equal partnerships, and for 1111 this means truly elaborating a common agenda with movements and human rights activists around the world, also working together with environmental movements, etc. Aid as we know it should be altered, not ended. International cooperation will always be needed, and sometimes it requires a distribution of financial resources. But this financial relation needs to embed it within a much broader framework of cooperation and also contain knowledge sharing, not capacity building, but also strengthening each other and reaching the shared agenda and being a social movement together, all starting from those common agendas. My third thought, yes, we as CSOs need to further decolonize our organizations themselves. Besides changing the way we cooperate across boundaries around the shared agenda of fighting injustice in an equal manner, there are lots of other domains where international CSOs need to roll their sleeves. Firstly, regarding the anti-racism debates and discussions, we must never lose sight of inequality in Belgium itself. Social economic inequality, but also inequality and discrimination based on identity and race. We should give more support to anti-racism movements without claiming their fight. No, we need to listen and hear how we can support and speak out in doing so. We have got a job to do, humble but firm, and we have failed to do so for the past years. Secondly, knowledge production. As said before, we need to be more aware of which knowledge we use and share. We need to actively look for unknown knowledge to us. For example, historical knowledge, but also on reconciliation, for example, or on how to develop a movement, how to define development. Thirdly, regarding framing and image creation, we need to be much more aware of our image creation and framing. Sometimes, or too often, we are too much absorbed in our own bubble to genuinely notice which frames and image creation we unconsciously strengthen and therefore help upholding a paternalistic image of the global south. Fourthly, representation. We need to change our decision-making procedures and institutions so other voices are being represented and power is being shared within our own organizations. Voices that bring about other knowledge, other experience, critical ideas, constructive ideas to the table. The Global South needs to be represented. Fifthly, cooperation with diaspora movements. We need to look for genuine cooperation. But for me, this is a big question because it's very hard to look at this not from a point of view of, okay, we want to cooperate with them, but we have to talk and we have to get an insight in what their aims are, what their goals are, what their aspirations are, and then see if they want to work with us. But I noticed that there will be a discussion in one of the following sessions, so I'm very interested in this session and will definitely join this one. To finish my reflection, my presentation, I would like to end with the one question of all questions. Do NGOs or CSOs working on international solidarity need to stop and dismantle? Or do they need to evolve, be it rapidly? My personal opinion is that they need to evolve. We do not need to dismantle, but evolving does not mean maintaining the status quo and put all efforts improving how much we are needed and how good we are doing and thinking. No. We need to stop defending ourselves and start to change within ourselves. We need to listen very hard. We need to be self-critical in a profound way. We need to be open to shift the power. We must truly work together. We need to be open to get out of our comfort zone, not knowing where it will lead us. We need to be able to take risks, to trust, to change narratives, to have the courage to let ourselves be guided by knowledge and practices that are not being considered mainstream at the moment. We need to be curious and righteous, open and driven by justice, and always be humble and aware of our privileges, and then use our privileges to change the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Els. It's very strange to not be able to applaud after both those presentations. But thanks so much. Thanks for the many thought-provoking insights. Thanks, Achille, for this interesting view on the many challenges that we are currently facing and sharing this idea also of techno-molecular colonialism. Thanks, Els, for the very honest account, I would say, and very self-critical lens of looking at your own sector, development aids, international solidarity, and to show the vulnerabilities and to voice the challenges that you are currently facing. And actually, listening to both of your presentations, so many questions pop up, and of course, I will try to stick to some of the most important questions that pop up in my mind, and also on the basis, as I said before, on what our students have submitted before this debate. So I propose that I just go straight into some of the questions. I can imagine that Achille probably also wants to react to some of else. Oh, sorry, I see that my video is not shared. I can imagine that Achille also wants to react, but maybe we can do that through some of the questions that I will now pose to both of you. So a first question, and I think that both of you have referred to this during your presentation, is that many post-colonial scholars have argued that our own discourses are very powerful tools which perpetuate or strengthen particular, often problematic ideas or concepts, and they kind of reinforce the status quo of current injustices. But at the same time, discourses, of course, also allow for new imaginaries to emerge. Why do we then still keep on using unhelpful binaries, such as you mentioned before, global north versus global south, third world versus first world, core versus periphery, developed versus underdeveloped countries, local and global, rural and urban, and many alternatives have popped up, but we still keep on, we are forced into this binary way of thinking about the problems that we are facing and some of the alternatives that are actually popping up. So some scholars such as Roptal Neajai Paley, I'm not sure if I pronounce her name correctly and I apologize for that, but they have argued that these binaries actually shackle us, they do not liberate. So what do you see or what do you think is the usefulness or problematic nature of framing these discussions by using these binaries? Do you see potential alternatives? Els honestly said, well, I'm open to look at alternatives, but for example, Achille mentioned this idea of living with the earth as a potential alternative to kind of transcend these binaries. So how do you look at some of these alternatives? Maybe Achille could start, and then maybe else you could complement or join the conversation as well.
I agree with the person who raised this issue. There are a number of ways of framing key contemporary debates which are not very helpful, precisely because they are founded on what he calls or she calls the binaries, dichotomies, and so forth and so on. This in itself is a legacy of ways of thinking and ways of positing the world which we have historically inherited from what I would call the Western archive. When you look at Western metaphysics, Western philosophy, Western epistemology, that is how it operates. It needs to institute a distinction between I, me, and that which is not me. And then it needs to, when confronted with an object, it needs to divide that object, to open it up, to describe its many different parts. Before reuniting those parts and articulating discourse about what it is. It also needs to classify it and to put it in hierarchy. That is how it operates. But not all ways of thinking or ways of inhabiting the world are like that. They do not proceed like that. This way of proceeding is not universal, not at all. For instance, Western philosophy is obsessed with the question of ontology, the being of things. When we look at African pre-colonial systems of thought, for instance, they are not at all obsessed with ontology, the being of things. They are very preoccupied with the question of relation. What is it that what is the network of relations A is embedded in? And it's through studying that network of relations that we can say something about A. It's not as if A had some identity that was only its identity, against which there were other identities, antagonistic or whatever you want. So all of that to say what? All of that to say that if we need to emerge out of that iron circle of dichotomies, of difference, of identities, maybe we might want to draw from the multiplicity of the archives we have inherited, and not on one dominant archive. Maybe we might want to get out of our zones of comfort and take the risk of meeting, encountering other ways of doing, other ways of being, other ways of thinking and of seeing. But understand that is a risky exercise. But in an age which I have called planetary, and throughout my presentation, I think that Els also insisted on that, that the age we live in is a planetary age. In the planetary age, there are a number of questions we now have to confront, one of which is the question of the in common. What is it that, in spite of all the differences, allows us to reimagine solidarity beyond our clan, our family, our tribe, our race, our religion, our nation? Solidarity between humans, but also solidarity between humans and non-humans. And that was a point I pushed forward quite forcefully. So if post-development, or whatever we want to call it, has any meaning, it's only in that kind of openness to the large world, and that kind of turning our back to modes of thought which indeed have been at the service of the occupation of the earth by one category of inhabitants of the earth. That's how I would answer this question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Els. Yes?
Yes, I will respond from a different perspective. You're a scholar. It's so interesting to listen to you, Achille. I'm a doer. So I will, and I'm living in Belgium. So what strikes me is, to answer the question of Gert, why is it so difficult to change discourse? It's because we feel that we use the words that I've learned those words when I was studying. This is the discourse that's being used in the mainstream media all the time, talking about North-South, talking about development, etc. So trying to change this means that it's more difficult to gain attention for the story you want to tell. So it's difficult due to fundraising or due to trying to reach a lot of people, but it's so necessary. And I think there's a lot of potential. For example, we're campaigning with the terminology of change makers, like talking about people that we work together worldwide. We're change makers, they're change makers. We want a more just world, ecologically, socially, economically. And when you try it, yeah, you notice that it works. And I think we have to go further, but we cannot develop this new discourse by ourselves because we're stuck in our bubble, in our knowledge and no way of speaking. So for me, it would be very interesting to start some kind of trajectory with scholars, with people in the field, just to develop a new kind of language, which we also can try to use here in Belgium and Flanders, and which we notice is being used elsewhere. And it's not only an academic discourse, because I notice there's a lot of new academic discourse, but really the discourse, the words you can use to reach out to the public, to politicians, because words do matter. If we start changing the words and start talking no longer about north-south and poor and rich, and I still do this, and I always think, no, I did it again. If we start changing the words in a very consequent manner, yes, we will start using other paradigms and find other entries to discuss on global issues. So, for example, we talk about global justice. For me, it entails ecological perspective, social and economic. That's a shift already, you know, when I compare when I entered the development scene, yeah, it's a shift already.
Mm-hmm. So. Thank you very much, Els. And I want to ask a follow-up question on the basis of your answers. But before I do, I have been receiving the important news that I need to tell you about, or to tell the whole audience that they can already raise their questions through an online polling system that will open in a second. And normally, well, there's the link. So if you click on that link, you can start asking or posing your questions, and other people can also vote for your questions. So in about 15 minutes, we will close this polling system, and then we will look at the most relevant questions so that all of you also have some type of voice in this debate as well. I just wanted to mention that. So please go to that link and pose your questions. So thanks for this round of response. Maybe a follow-up question, and I know this may be very provocative, but please really take it as a constructive, as a way to engage in a conversation. Some people, like Olivia Rutazibwa, for example, they argue that the consequence of taking decolonization of the development aid sector seriously would ultimately mean the need to dismantle the whole sector because of different reasons. What would be your response? What are both of your views on this? Do you think you can fundamentally address systemic injustices without dismantling the very same structure on which the need for development aid actually arises? Maybe Els, you want to answer first, and then Achille could also jump in.
Well, it's my personal opinion that you cannot dismantle without knowing what will become in place, and it just personally just stop. I see the assets, not the needs, but I see the assets, and I also see, for example, human rights activists with whom we work together. If we would tell to them, okay, now from this day to another, we stop funding you, because you can argue it's a political cooperation that you have, stop the donor-recipient relationship. She or he or the movement will not be able to do what they need to do in their difficult context. So for me, that is not an option, but I want to be criticized and challenged in the way we do this very profoundly. So with people as Olivia, but also otherwise, yes, criticize, we'll listen, and we have to change, so, and rapidly. So, but for me, dismantling is not the way before you know what will be set in place.
Thank you very much for that very clear answer. Achille, would you like to react?
It's a very complex question, and you see, I'll just give you a concrete example coming from the place where I live and work, which is South Africa. In South Africa, we used to have a terrible system here, really a bad system, pretty inhuman, I have to say, inhuman and a system was also ecologically disastrous, because the two usually go together. When you are awful with human beings, you are also awful with the environment, with the ecosystem. And then, since the system couldn't change, couldn't auto-correct, self-correct, because some systems have the resources ingrained in them to change course, to reform, and others don't. And where you are facing a system that doesn't give any evidence that it can change, it can respond to legitimate demands, then you have to destroy it. And then you have to dismantle it, you have to decommission it. That's how history works. But there is always a price to dismantling it, to decommissioning it. Then you have to see what is that price and who will bear the cost. How will we share the cost as equitably as possible? How will we make sure that it's not always the same who pay the price, who bear the brunt of the dismantling of unjust structures? So it seems to me that these are ethical decisions and political decisions which need to be debated. And we need to know that there will be a price to pay. Who will pay it? But what worries me at times is the fact that in the kind of critical zone our world finds itself now, in the critical zone and the planet and numerous populations find themselves, the risk is that many people might want to believe that things cannot get worse than this, and therefore might be willing to look into the ways in which we can start anew. Let's have a clean slate. The temptation of a clean slate is, I would argue, part of the atmosphere of this moment. Now, when the temptation for a clean slate is not subjected to reason, rational, critical engagement, it becomes visceral. And viscerality and nihilism, let's say the distance between visceralism, visceral politics, and nihilism, that distance is not that low. So the question is, how do we reignite, rekindle the faculty of reason in an age of unreason, in an age when we do no longer know what's the difference between fact and fiction, who is whom, in an age when all that we dream about is to secede from everybody else. So it seems to me that it's really whoever asked that question is pointing his or her finger onto a major tribulation of our age. And as you see from Els and my response, I mean, the response is not necessarily clear-cut.
Thank you very much. Els, did you want to still react to that, or is that okay? Or can I go to the next one?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I really love the response of Achille. It helps me in addressing this issue. Yeah, the question who will pay the price, and that's a discussion you need to have with populations involved. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. And then I have another question, and I'm just also looking at the time, and it's always ridiculous how fast the time goes. Are we in a way talking in different languages on what decolonization means. And I will explain this question a bit more. How do we translate the implication of these different languages or the different meanings across different contexts? For example, in academia, these discussions may be more likely to be encouraged than they are in a particular policy circle, or in policy circles such as within development banks, where the possibility for alternative thinking around development cooperation may be much more constrained, of course. So how do we understand the different power relations that force us to change the way we articulate what decolonization refers to according to who we are talking to? And I think this is particularly concerning when we are talking about decolonization, which is a missile word. It's not made to be able to fit in the status quo. It needs to unsettle the status quo. So how do we navigate these contradictions? Maybe that's a question for Achille, and then maybe Els could also share some of her thoughts on this.
You see, I would be, I don't know how to define decolonization. I'm not just playing games. I mean, I'm genuinely at pain to define what it is. And I gather part of me would like to leave that an open-ended. But I have a few intuitions. I just maybe start with some examples. The example of debates, for instance, on restitution of African objects which are kept in Western museums and such cultural institutions. I have in mind too a whole set of debates on reparation, or if you want, on reparative justice. The assumption being that in the encounter between Africa and the world, many things have happened. And some of them have contributed to the destruction of one form or another of African vital forces. That we keep coming back to that question of the politics of life and the politics of care, the politics of maintenance, politics of repair, matters of taking care of and making a space for. It seems to me there's this dimension of decolonization which aims precisely at reconstituting the reservoir of vital forces without which the world becomes uninhabitable for some. They are expelled from the world as a consequence of the injuries and violence which have crippled them and made it very difficult for them to act as autonomous beings, human, in relation to other humans. So that element of restoration, I think, is absolutely fundamental. Now, of course, I mean, as an academic, I know that there are other conceptions of decolonization that go beyond that. We all have read a bit of Fanon, we have read about Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and many others. Hold on to this element in line with what I have been trying to push tonight, in line of the renewed concern, not for the biological as such, in light of the renewed concern for the biosphere. Because I really believe that it is here that the stakes are. It is from here that we can rebuild solidarity, international solidarity. It is from here that we can, it's here that we can rebuild something in common beyond the politics of difference. But that's a rather abstract response. But I'm convinced that we can apply it to very concrete situations, as I have seen here in South Africa and elsewhere.
Thank you very much. Els, I can see you also want to react.
Yes, very briefly from a more practical point of view, perhaps, to answer your question, Gert, about how come that in an academic world or like civil society world, it's gaining more priority than, for example, in a development bank. I think it's due to the proximity. We're really in dialogue with people, activists, and civil society organizations in different countries. I can imagine in the academic world, you have this discussion because you're more and more interlinked, working together across boundaries. So it's actually our partner organizations, the people we work with, they are pushing us, and in a too gentle way, I guess. But since we're also inheritance of this colonial relationship, for me it's really about shifting the power. So they push us. They want to have a dialogue with us. Some years ago it was about the common agenda. So they pushed the ecological agenda. At this point, they really want to talk with us about equal partnerships and how do we discuss our common agenda and how can we give feedback to the political claims you put forward in Belgium, how we want to discuss this and we want to work on this together. So there's a shift in this relationship and it's really coming from them. And I think for me, so in a very concrete way for 1111, it's really being open to shift this power, to really look with organizations and activists you work with, how are we going to rebalance this relationship and really change the way we work? But it's in a very concrete level, so it's not the abstract answer that Achille has been giving, but for me it's really about shifting the power in those relations, and we're being pushed, and which is a very good sign by our spokespersons and the people we work with whom we have partnerships. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, I'm again, I have to look at the time and also give the floor now to the broader audience. And there's this poll, as I said before, and I'm looking to the most popular questions at this moment. So one of the top questions is directed to Els, but I'm sure that Achille also could perhaps share some insights. So the question is, do you think you lose a lot of volunteers, mainly white people in 1111, by leaving the colonial perspective that the organization works in now, since some people might be attracted through the idea of white saviorism? I would add what kind of challenge does this also pose in terms of how to decolonize the minds of the volunteers and donors themselves as well, of course. So what would be your thoughts on this, Els? Els, are you still there?
Okay, so I was muted. Sorry.
Okay.
No,
okay.
it was, yeah. So it's a very interesting question, and it is a challenge. But for me, taking up decolonization as a priority does not mean okay, and now we need to have every month a very sharp, written. Open letter in a newspaper, but no, it's really about walking the talk, changing the way we talk about our partnerships, the way we talk about what development should be. And so we have to invest in discussing and debating with our volunteers. And we've been doing this for the past year. And what I realize is when we have these discussions in a really vulnerable and open way, it's being said, yeah, but I do not have to feel guilty, and it's all. I have good intentions, but then you have this discussion, and you see people, volunteers, realizing, okay, but we still share the same goal, and we have to change, and let's do this together. But it's of course a very long trajectory to be able to have these discussions at the local level with everyone, and being able to. For people to also really speak out, yeah, how this makes them feel, and that they do not have to feel guilty, but that we just have to change, and it's society is always changing. So if we don't change and we don't listen, then we become irrelevant. So it's a challenge, but for me, it's we have no option than not to do this, and I'm very confident and that as a movement, as a global movement, we are able to tackle this. And why I say it before, for example, Broederlijk Delen, it's an NGO that's really rooted like in DRC, but they were like at the forefront of this of putting forward the narrative of sharing, putting forward the narrative of decolonization. They discuss this with their volunteers, and they have a very strong campaign putting this forward. So I believe it's possible, but it's difficult, but it's possible. Yeah.
Definitely, thanks. Achille, would you like to react to this question as well? The idea of white saviorism.
No, it's a bad idea. I mean, it's very clear.
Yeah.
It's not a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
And the sooner we move away from it, the better it will be for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So we need a critique of that ideology. It's a very old ideology. It has been mutating all along. I mean, as I said, it's a bad idea, bad concept. Get rid of it. How Els probably has better answers than me as to how effectively this can be done. But it goes. I mean, one way to do it is to regain some sense of historical consciousness. You see, what strikes me when I travel, I used to. Now I'm in confinement in South Africa. I haven't been traveling at all, and it doesn't seem to affect me too much. But I used to travel in Europe. Part of what strikes me in Europe is the extent to which now I'm really going into terrible generalizations for which I apologize, but the level of ignorance about Europe's history outside of its borders, in reference to colonialism, for instance. So one has to wonder whether it's a kind of willful ignorance, because you see, it serves all kinds of purposes to not know, to not want to know. One of which is, okay, I don't know, I mean, I'm not responsible. The idea being that knowledge, to know, comes with responsibilities. The moment I know, what do I do? So I don't want to know because I don't want to do anything. Now, where we need to be going is in a direction where the question of the in common becomes the core, the center of articulation of any experience of translocal solidarity beyond our borders, with people we believe ultimately will save themselves. They cannot be saved. They cannot outsource their liberation. Nobody can outsource his or her liberation. So they will have to save themselves. And what we can do is to create the conditions for them to save themselves, to not become obstacles in the overall project of their liberation. The belief being that if they liberate themselves, we will all be liberated in that act. I see that emergence of that kind of planetary consciousness. For instance, in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, we saw elements of it. I'm not saying that we have arrived there, but we saw it. We saw people for whom the death of George Floyd was not only his death, who recognized that something had died in themselves. Although they were not George Floyd, they were not black in America in particular. So it seems to me that that's where we have to go. That the kind of consciousness we need to raise in this planetary age, in tune with the kinds of interconnections we were talking about in relation not only to humans, but also to animals. There's plenty of new studies on animal life now, on the life of other species. Full recognition that we humans are not the only inhabitants of the earth. And then we have to share that earth by giving a place to it, making a place to all. So I really believe that we need to push in that direction if things like white saviorism or other colonial forms of humanitarianism have to make way for richer interactions.
Thank you, Achille. Maybe there's time for one last question already. We're already nearing the end of this conversation. And going through the questions, also taking into account some of the things that might already have been addressed in some of the previous answers. There's this question that states the following. Achille mentioned the rise of ethno-nationalism and the pushback against multilateralism. How can an embrace of alternative ways of living with the earth steer clear from rising fascist tendencies shaping development relations which double down on anti-blackness and ecological exploitation? It's quite a challenging question.
Yes, it is.
A good one to end with.
No, I'm sure Els has a lot of things to say about it.
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult question, but it's I think at the moment one of the most important questions for movements or anyone that wants to be engage to change the world in a more equal and more just way. For me, just let me answer this in a very personal way, because I think it's a question that you pose yourself. For me, is I look for what I said in my presentation. I look for events, spaces, encounters where I see that people still have hope, and that they're looking and for a change, and they're trying at the local level and regional level to really go into debate with people who think differently, who try to live with nature in a different way. And for me, it's just very hopeful, and for me, it gives energy to keep on speaking, to stating my opinion, to remaining politically active, to discuss in a very diplomatic way with my family and my friends. And so for me, it's just the way you look at society and what gives you hope. For me, that's just the only way that every individual has to keep on acting in what they seem just, needs to look for connection with family, friends, and movements they have, and then needs to believe that worldwide you have different movements having the same analysis and the same responses as, for example, Achille has given today. So will it be the answer to hold back fascism? I don't know. It's like history tells us it's always a cycle, and when you look back at history, you can say, okay, this is when it went wrong, and maybe people should have done this more fiercely, but we don't know. So for me, the only thing is to have a straight idea of what for me is a just and equal society, and to take up my own responsibility and try to connect with others, and then it's just believing that this will buffer other more negative trends, and that in the end this will win. I just don't know how deep as a global society we still have to go before we go up again. But yeah, that's just a very personal answer to how I deal with this very global and important question.
Thanks, Els. Achille, would you like to add something to that answer, or something completely different?
No, I think that, I mean, the way I understand what Els is saying is that we probably need to multiply spaces of care, because the reality around us is one of really a broken world. It's a world in need of repair, in all senses of the term. So how is it we contribute to the emergence of global care chains, if you want, is the whole problem of solidarity she was putting on the table. So that question of care and repair is absolutely crucial. But it implies, of course, dealing with the many zones of neglect and the many zones of abandonment, which produce what I was calling in the presentation superfluous people, who everywhere we go are treated in the manner in which waste is managed. That these people are waste, they are treated as such, they are left out of the grid, and yet where infrastructures of care are absent, or where they are unreliable, we know that the gaps are usually filled. I mean, when I travel in the continent, what strikes me the most, wherever I go, Lagos, Abidjan, Dakar, Nairobi, when I land, is a number of people repairing something. So if we build on those ecologies of repair, it seems to me we can confront the drive for fascism, the huge desire for apartheid, which is saturating our world indeed. So that's how I would let's say, rephrase what Els shared with us.
Thank you very much, and I'm afraid that time's up. There's so many other questions that we could possibly ask, but I really would like to thank both of you for engaging in this conversation and for sharing your thoughts on things that are so important to further discuss. And yeah, normally I would also ask for a warm round of applause. Which is not possible at this moment. But I'm also asked, before everybody goes, I can see that many people are already leaving. And after thanking you, I'm also asked to make some publicity for next week. As Els also mentioned before, there's a lot of upcoming other debates that are very interesting and that you might be interested in. So next week we have a debate on decolonizing ecological relations with Diana Vela Almeida, a postdoctoral researcher in the geography department at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and with our colleague Vijay Krishnan Kolinjivadi here at the IOB. So the same day, same hour, make sure to check our website for updated links for the registration form. They're not always already available, but take a look at all these different debates and make sure to register. And also at the very end, on the 1st of December, for those of you who are in Belgium, we have a closing event at the studio with Nadia Nsai, Mohamed Bari, and Sekou Wolegem, if Corona allows, of course, a physical event there. So maybe we hope there will also be a live streaming of the event possible. So that's all, and thanks again to both Els and Achille for this very nice conversation. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you so much. Thanks, Els.
Thank
you. Bye. Bye.
See you.
Send me the
Thank you,
link for the next session.
Yes.
Sorry?
No, thanks so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
And take care of the 3 girls.
Yeah. One question. Do you keep the questions? Can you send them to us?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I will keep the questions. I will share